Hi, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of the amazing Alchemy Lab with myself, Colm Holland. I'm the author of this book, The Secret of the Alchemist, which is all about my meeting and the early days of when I published The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho 27 years ago. And here I am today with yet another esteemed guest in the Alchemy Lab. For those of you that have been watching the series will know that one of the topics that we usually end up talking about in the lab is what the ancient alchemists called transmutation. In their case, they were trying to change lead into gold, but for us today, what we're talking about mostly is personal transformation, where we're trying to enable ourselves to transform to becoming our real true selves. And my guest today is definitely somebody who's devoted most of their life to this particular activity. I'm thrilled to invite to the Alchemy Lab, Robert Sachs. Hi, Robert.
Colm, wonderful to be with you.
Thank you so much for coming. You're talking all the way from Oceano in California, am I right?
That is correct. That is correct. About a mile from the beach.
A mile from the beach, fantastic. So if there's a tsunami, you've got a bit of a chance of surviving then.
We're about 200 feet above sea level, so it would have to be a really whopping big tsunami. But hopefully we're not going to see this just yet.
No. Any earthquakes recently?
We get them periodically. I mean, you know, we're near the San Andreas fault line, so things do rumble periodically. You know, sometimes you're sitting in a chair and you feel a little bit wobbly, and you realize that was not you on anything. It was just the earth doing its thing.
Okay, that's fantastic. So let's just fill people in a little bit about you. You're primarily an author. You've written many books. You're well known for being a devotee of the Tibetan Buddhist masters, and you've taught a lot as a result of what you've learned under them. But you also run seminars and workshops. You've lectured at the Chopra Center, and we're thrilled to have you here today. Welcome. You're writing at the moment. What are you writing?
Well, I at this point, what it is I don't have a book project, but I've sort of coined the phrase that I've become the Facebook rabbi. So I've got probably about over the last 4 years, when I look at current events or I look at a situation that comes up either locally or nationally or internationally, I will usually make some kind of observation, which hopefully just makes sort of like decompresses people from getting so freaked out by what they're experiencing, and hopefully giving them some tools that they can use to work through their own minds and decisions as to what they're going to do. So I've been looking at the fact that I've been doing these like 500 to 700 word essays on Facebook for so many years. I'm thinking of compiling it and doing a book, Confessions of a Facebook Rabbi. But then on the other side, I have I am, in terms of, and we'll go into it, I am a Freemason. Not many Freemasons talk about that, but because it's in the book and because George Washington was a Freemason, it is part of the discussion. I am what is called an orator for a particular valley of Freemasonry in Scottish Rite. And so I do essays usually about subjects that are, how do you translate more spiritual values into operationalizing them in real time. So I do a lot of writing about that. So I'm at this point not looking at any long tome. I'm considering doing a tribute to a friend of mine that just passed away. His name was Basil Jenkins. Hopefully people will hear that name in the future. An amazing man who wrote a book of Buddhist poetry, which I'm hoping to get out on his behalf in honor of him. So haven't started that yet, but right now I'm just doing these little ditties for Facebook and Scottish Rite.
You call them little ditties. I'm sure they're extremely profound, and people are benefiting all right. So we are going to talk about your latest book, but we've sort of rehearsed this. I hope it's going to work. Before we talk about your book, and I'm not even going to mention the title at this point, I am actually going to try and attempt to play some music on this podcast. So I'm just going to unplug my earphones. So hopefully everybody can still hear me now. Can you hear me, Robert? Yeah, okay. Here we go. I'm going to play something, and this is totally relevant to Robert's new book. So this is a bit of a rave from the grave, but here we go. Thrown like a star in my sleep, I opened my eyes to take a peek, to find the light was by the sea, gazing with tranquility. The good man comes singing songs of love. Then when the hurdy-gurdy man comes singing songs of love. Hurdy-gurdy, 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 hurdy-gurdy. So why am I playing a song by a guy called Donovan, who is definitely somebody from your past and my past? Apparently you were in the UK when Donovan was, as I used to call, Top of the Pops. And I remember that song really well. In fact, I think I had the record in vinyl, of course. So this is an introduction to your book. Your book is called The Path of Civility, Perfecting the Lessons of a President by Applying the Wisdom of a Buddha. What on earth has Donovan and that song got to do with a book of that title?
Well, I mean, the part that we didn't get to in the song is the history of ages past, unenlightened shadows cast down through all eternity, the crying of humanity, and then comes the hurdy-gurdy man. And really what I was looking at was, well, on the Buddhist side, you have the idea of enlightenment, and then you have the life of George Washington and the influences on him during the ages of enlightenment in the West. And really what it is that if you honestly look at the backgrounds of these two men, it's not that different, not really. Of course, what it is, and I had a reviewer get all irritated with me comparing the two, because I think what ends up happening is we look at the life of the Buddha and we apply, there's a Tibetan term called namtar, which means sacred biography. And a sacred biography is basically the way in which we airbrush someone from the past and make them almost less than human, and then idealize them, and then we lose the real background of who they are and what they went through. And basically, the Buddha came from an aristocratic family. Essentially, he was very, very well educated, but was really cloistered. And what happened was he went out into the world. He essentially, what you could say, and I say this in one of my books, Passionate Buddha, is that he became like a deadbeat dad. Because what he did was he walked out on his wife and he walked out on his baby to find himself, And so what he does is he discovers some of the crueler realities of life in terms of birth, sickness, old age, and death, which are the part and parcel of what we as human beings go through. And then you have Washington, who was basically landed gentry in America, very, very well off, had servants like the Buddha did. We can say he had slaves because welcome to the reality of the 1700s, being white aristocratic gentry. But he was, he ended up becoming a soldier early on, but at the same time encountered the Enlightenment principles in the form of Freemasonry. And a lot of what Freemasonry talks about, it's very interesting. In Freemasonry, and especially one branch of Freemasonry, it talks about that what we need to do in the world around us is to eradicate ignorance, fanaticism, and tyranny. Interestingly enough, in terms of Buddhism, the idea is to transform the transformation of three poisons of ignorance, same as ignorance, attachment, which is like fanaticism, and aggression, which is the same as tyranny. So to me, you have sort of like the mandate that Washington lived by and ascribed to, and the Buddha following very, very different paths at very, very different times. But it wasn't hard for me because it was like the meeting of two aspects of who I am. I mean, I've been involved with Buddhist tradition since 1973, 74. And my Freemasonry is relatively new, but a lot of it came from a curiosity just watching the devolution of American politics and realizing that really, and this was from some of the writing I did, some of my other books in terms of Becoming Buddha, the Wisdom of the Buddhist Masters, is understanding that the social and political realities are not any things that we can sort of escape or disregard. As far as I'm concerned, if you wake up in the morning and brush your teeth, that has political consequences, you know? So for me, it was not a hard thing to see the combination and then to see it all kind of come together in Donovan.
Okay, so that's where Donovan fits in.
That's where Donovan comes in.
So I'm loving reading your book. I just want you to know.
Thank you.
You cover lots of topics that I'm personally quite passionate about. I used to teach history at high school, and I've always been fascinated with the development of societies and where the bedrock of the philosophies that drive and build societies come from. And I think I was saying to you earlier, as I was reading the book, it felt like I was watching somebody like Jackson Pollock, the artist, with two big brushes, in one in each hand. In the one hand, here's George Washington and his background of humanism and of the 17th century and Enlightenment, and how the beginnings of the division of church and state, thank goodness, were founded, and that came into the founding of American Constitution. And then on the other hand, you've got the Buddha and all of his philosophical teachings as well. And it's like you've taken these two brushes and you've hit the canvas, and you kind of, I got a bit scared at the beginning. Oh no, how is Robert going to pull this off? And I have to say, I actually think you've done a masterpiece. I think
Thank you.
You've then stepped back. So, when I first thought, okay, what is this book about? And I began to read the synopsis. Oh gosh, okay, I wonder how this is going to pan out. But it's beautiful.
Thank you.
You've managed to integrate, in my mind, two of the most important strands of our recent time that have shaped the civility, and we'll define what you mean by civility in a moment, but our ability to survive together and to build lives together in societies. I've always been conscious that there's a huge danger, and if I'm getting on my soapbox here now, you've got to stop me, but I've always thought there is this great danger that in our generations now, we're in danger of forgetting the hard work and the sacrifices and the diligence and the devotion and the public service that our forebears have put in to create these societies so that we're not, we're not all killing each other every 5 minutes. We're not all at each other's throats. And it is becoming a bit terrifying that in our generation now we are seeing what I think many commentators, not just me, are saying that, an undermining of those basic principles of humanity that have enabled us to progress, not always progress in the right direction. It's debatable sometimes, but on the whole, life keeps improving because of the foundations that these people built, such as George Washington, such as the Buddha, and many others that we could care to mention. You've chosen those two. So that's the end of my soapbox rant. But what I want to ask you then, so from what you've just heard me say, Robert, the motivation that drove you to write this particular book, The Path of Civility, was that coming out of the observations that you were making? Did you feel that you're on a bit of a mission with this book? Is this part of that Freemasonry, that desire to educate, to try and remove ignorance in some way?
I think well, there's different aspects to it. I had done a book many years ago called The Buddha at War, which a lot of people got very upset with the title of it because they didn't like the idea of Buddha and war being in the same title. Right. My particular Tibetan teacher, Kunzig Shamar Rinpoche, loved the title. He just said, yeah, I mean, we are in essence at war with those tendencies of ignorance, attachment, and aggression inside ourselves, and it manifests in terms of the cultures that are around us. And what I was really looking at was, how do you stay present and engaged in the world without succumbing to apathy or anger or depression? And so what I wanted to do was really help people to construct a kind of mindfulness to allow them to engage in whatever they were experiencing around them. And so that was pretty much the thrust of that book, which then became known as Becoming Buddha. The Buddha word morphed into Becoming Buddha. And then I interviewed a number of teachers about what they saw in the world around them. The evolution into civility was, okay, if you're going to stay engaged, and this was possibly the next step for me, and I had mentioned to you before we came on the air that a few years back I became the master of a Masonic lodge, and suddenly got thrust into a position of authority like I had never experienced before. I mean, I've never been an authoritarian dad, I've always believed in cooperation. These kind of roles, whether it's a CEO or a president or whatever, or a master of a lodge, can imply that there's a kind of a tendency towards being either autocratic or authoritarian. And I believed in cooperation. And so to me, I was thrust into an environment where I had to work with a much broader sector of the population. I was no longer dealing with people of the New Age or Buddhist communities that want to just get along and whatever, although I'd say that there's nothing more political than a religious organization. And so what I had to do is really look at how to maintain a position of my role, or my authority of my role, and at the same time invite participation in what Freemasonry calls like being on the level, and what Buddhism calls with a sense of equanimity, And so to me, it became kind of an obvious step. And then I started getting invited. One was a past Grand Master of the state of California's Freemasons, who does a lot about civility. And I really began to look at what he was doing. And so right now I'm a part of what's called the Worldwide Civility Council. We're getting involved with initiating a conference in Washington, D.C. If we can do it, it might just be virtual, for 2021 called The Urgency of Civility, because the reality is people are just getting nastier and nastier in the public domain. That being said, and I want, because it was leading into something that you were, in terms of the evolution of things and looking at this time. I go back to a teaching of the historical Buddha, who gave a prediction of this time, that in this time period we would enter into a stage of what in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism, is called Lung, and in Sanskrit and Ayurveda it's called Vata. And what that means is, on a physical level, a lot of nervous system, emotional distress at a psychological level, but a lot of degenerative disease. But what also Vata is about, in its higher sense, and this is about transformation, by the way, where you transform the three poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aggression to be the rainbow body, or transformational information, a deeper seeing, and compassion. That what it is along with this Vata, which makes people get reactive, there's also a part of Vata which allows people to step back. And as they step back, they see a bigger picture. And so it's kind of like the curtain has been lifted on all sorts of iniquities that we sort of have disguised in the name of civilization, that are no longer that well disguised in terms of systemic racism, in terms of sexism, in terms of anti-Semitism, and an intolerance for different people that believe different than we do. Those things are more obvious, and media makes it possible to make it more obvious, but it's also like people are waking up to these things, and really, I'd say at this point, maybe you learned your Buddhism in the 70s, but welcome to 2020, and it's time to see where the rubber meets the road.
No, I get that totally, Robert. That's a really good description. In your book, you talk quite a bit about the reality of praise and blame. Do you want to just unpack that a bit for us? Because there is a lot of praise going on in social media, and there's also a lot of blame going on. But you say that there's a point in which we need to be realistic about where we lay praise and where we lay blame. Can you explain a bit more of that to us?
There's a California expression, which is, it's all good. It's all good, man. And I've heard that said over and over and over again. And when it was said to me at one point, it was during a time when I was actually working with someone, a friend of mine, who was dying, and there was a circle of people around him. And this one young man said, "Oh, it's all good." And I said, "Well, there's good, and then there's Lansing Boyle good, you know. And sometimes things are not that pleasant, but they're necessary." And then another phrase that reminds me, that I'm reminded of, and I'm not sure who said it. I know I ascribe it to this one rabbi who said that my role is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And I think of the idea of in putting in the context of praise and blame. I'm always a bit wary when someone praises me too much. Okay, it's kind of the inverse of Shakespeare's line, "Methinks thou protesteth too much."
Yep.
And so when I hear somebody going on that kind of rant, I just kind of feel like there's a Buddhist slogan that says, "Don't wait in ambush." And I think of praise statements being things which are oftentimes unexamined, that they are, they don't meet the critical smell test in many respects.
Yep. Yep.
And the same way that I look at blame, when you look at any situation, there are so many more dimensions to any particular situation as to why people do what they do, that they weren't going out unilaterally to be bastards. You know, they weren't necessarily going to do that. I mean, I would say, there can be people that are egoically or egotistically so lost that they do heinous things. But within the realm of Buddhism, there's no such thing as absolute evil. There just isn't. And so to me, I'm very cautious of that. I mean, I can be upset with what someone does, but I hope that if I can, and I mentioned in this book, be able to step back and inquire what went into that decision.
Got it.
You know, in the same way with praise, it's like, you know, I'm sorry, I'm not ready for a cocktail party just yet.
Now, you brought up the phrase that I was using earlier, which is transformation. Was there a point, one or other, in your life when you were conscious that you personally went through a significant transformational moment? Was there a time, was that associated with Buddhism? I guess you weren't born Buddhist. It sounds as though you come from a Jewish background.
Right.
So where's that? What transitions took place in your background?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to give you one little. I mean, there's any number of things I can think of, but this one relates to me living in the UK. I went up to. Well, I mean, the story that leads up to me being in the UK is that I was hitchhiking through Europe with a friend, and it was in the early 70s. It was definitely the Magical Mystery Tour. We got to meet the drug culture of England at the Roundhouse and whatever, but ended up in Amsterdam. And I had never been, and I was American, and I was wearing an American jacket. And so everybody was trying to sell me drugs. I wasn't into drugs at the time, but I was American. So obviously people thought I should be into drugs, but I wasn't. But what happened was on the way, we hitchhiking from Amsterdam to Paris, we got picked up in a VW bus with a guy that looked like a red-haired Jesus freak. He was English. He had been living at Coghu Samueling in Eskdalemuir in Scotland. And so I asked him where he lived. He told me where he lived in Eskdalemuir. And I said, well, what's it like being there? And he said, it's the kind of place that every time you turn a corner, you walk into yourself. And that phrase clicked in my head. And I said, I guess I'm going there. So I got a junior year abroad. I ended up at Samueling. And there was one day when I decided it's the lowlands of Scotland. And I was wandering in the hills and I found a sort of like a broken down wall of stone. And I was tired, and it was windy and it was cold, and I sat down behind the wall to get away from the wind. And I just closed my eyes. And I don't know how long my eyes were closed, but when I opened my eyes, I was covered in snow.
Wow.
And something definitely happened in that moment, in that time period. It was timeless. It was like being dusted with good fairy dust. Something happened, and within the next few days, I ended up getting more actively involved the Buddhism that was there. I hadn't been. I mean, I went there out of curiosity. I wasn't Buddhist at the time, but in that time is when I committed myself to becoming or getting involved with Buddhist tradition.
Amazing. Just to put your experience into context, my book, which is The Secret of the Alchemist, is actually partly a critique of the original book by Paulo Coelho, The Alchemist. And there were two incidences in your description of your experience there that just remind me so much of Paulo's time. So in the 1970s, of course, he was a hippie. And in fact, Paulo's latest book is called Hippie. And he was on one of those buses that you just described that started in Amsterdam. So that's, and the other one.
Interesting.
Yeah, well, it doesn't end there, of course, because those that know the story of the Alchemist, the fable that Paulo originally wrote, the hero of the story, Santiago, falls asleep in a stone abandoned chapel out in the countryside. So there's a lot of synchronicity going on there, Robert, which I love the sound of. So I grew up went to school in the UK. I didn't go to school in the US. If I'd gone to high school in the US, presumably am I still taught about the founding fathers and the principles, the shining city on a hill? Is that still taught in state school to pupils? So anybody who's grown up in an American education system, are they going to resonate? Are they going to understand what you've written about George Washington?
I think they will. I mean, for one thing, what it is, I mean, this is a story that is relevant to Washington in his life, is that he wasn't really all that well educated. He only went through 8 years of schooling. But while he was a young man, he was given this little tiny pamphlet, which was from Francis Hawkins, British author writing in the 1600s, who had translated or gotten a text from Jesuits from France, which was, how do you raise aristocratic young men to take their place in society? Mm-hmm. And so there was this section called the Rules of Civility. Right. And what Washington did was study it and study it and study it and apply it as best he could. It really became sort of like his own little Bible, if you will, in terms of how he would handle himself in social circumstances and political circumstances. This isn't something that's known really about Washington, but it gives people background. I mean, people should know that Washington was a general, obviously, in terms of the Revolutionary War. I mean, I touch upon that a little bit, so I don't make the history too heavy for people. But what I would say is that the average person who reads it will get enough history to understand who Washington is. But sadly, what I would say is that, my wife is English. And so she would say that she really didn't learn world history, or if she learned world history, it was basically the history of the empire.
Yes.
And so in my situation, there were classes on civics. Again, a more airbrushed, patriotic view of America. Basically, the Pilgrims are about wearing funny hats and eating turkey, that kind of thing, and making friends with the Indians, not knowing the real history behind it. But what's sad about it at this point is even that airbrushed history is, like you're describing earlier, Colm, is that these lessons, even in the more airbrushed forms, are being lost. People are not knowing who people are in history. So, I probably chose a conspicuous one because it's meeting the times.
I get it. And the subtitle, Perfecting the Lessons of a President by Applying the Wisdom of a Buddha, that's going to get everybody picking it up, because they're going to want to know, well, is it the current president that he's talking about, or somebody else? Let's not go there right now, but
Yeah.
good title. I love it. So I'm cooking up something. I'm just mixing it up here in the Alchemy Lab. I've got this thing called the Civility Salve. Now, a salve is like an ointment or a cream that heals wounds. I think this is one of the things that we need right now as a society, in the West particularly, is a civility salve that can bring us back and heal some of the wounds that have begun to open up. So if you were going to, based on your book, if you had to summarize the key ingredients of how we should be relating, based on what you know from the Buddha, what you know from George Washington, what's your takeaway? What are the key things that we should be mindful of as we relate to each other again?
Well, civility really relies on the idea of a sense of mutuality. And that's an important, and I would say the mutuality or being on the level is an important ingredient. And it could be part of the salve that you're creating. At the same time, I realize, and this is why I looked into the Buddha's teachings on the different levels of compassion: pacifying, enriching, magnetizing compassion, and wrathful compassion, and looked at them in terms of civility. That what we need to do is realize that in the end, in the beginning, we ourselves need to feel like all of us are equal in the eyes of God. Mm-hmm. We have to have that sense of being equanimous and having that equal say, so to speak. That's an important part to start with. And so we need that. And at the same time, to apply that salve into the world, to massage it into situations or for other people, requires us to understand where they come from and where they are in that notion. I mean, so many people have notions of hierarchies and entitlement and whatever that make civility very, very difficult.
Yep.
Okay. And therefore, that's why I talk about, okay, if we're all on the same page, which is that peaceful form of civility or compassion, we're all in this kumbaya world, but we need to be aware of becoming too smug. Okay. Maybe we think the situation needs to be explained more. There needs to be more education, but we don't act like we're smarter than others. Sometimes there are people that are really convinced by ideas that are not helpful to them and others, and they need to be sort of seduced from the dark side. They need to be giving weighing up of options so they can reason and understand with reason. And then there are some people which you literally have to stop them in their tracks and not allow them to harm others. For example, I say that the man who stood in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square was demonstrating a wrathful form of civility. That's what he did. In the end, what happens is that the need to create the mutual dialogue is what you hope will be the outcome. So to me, I'd like to start with me being able to go into the lab with a big pound of mutuality and stir it into your mix, and then use it in small amounts or large amounts, depending on what the circumstance needs.
Okay, well, you might need a big tube in certain cases.
Big tube.
Yeah, okay. You talk about, and we've nearly run out of time, so we'll close in a moment. But in the beginning of your book, you open with Gandhi. And I remember when I was living in Coventry, and I visited the cathedral, and it was just after Gandhi's death, actually, not long after his death. In little exhibition in Coventry Cathedral, there was his cloak, the hand woven garment that he wore, and his little spinning outfit and so on. If anybody epitomized, and I'm glad you referred to him in your book, if anybody epitomized living out what you and I have been talking, then it would have to be Gandhi, I would say. And so if we struggle with George Washington, or if we're not quite sure about historic Buddha and so on, then if we just need to look at at least one life where both of those really came, those attributes came together, it would have to be Mahatma Gandhi, I would say. And
I would agree.
He's a big hero of mine, and he single-handedly managed to civilly remove the British Empire from the continent of India when all the warlords and all the tribes would have failed completely through passive resistance. He managed, and I think he is potentially a prophet again for our time, where passive resistance is possibly one of the ways that we're going to have to bring civility again to some areas of our society, both east and west.
It's true.
Thank you, Robert. The Jackson Pollock, in my opinion, of writing.
Thank you.
Fabulous stuff, and I'm not overpraising you there. That is a genuine feeling that I have about your book. So your book is available from the end of August. Again, just remind everybody, it's called The Path of Civility by my guest, Robert Sachs. And if you Google it, you'll probably find an online bookshop near you that you can order it from. And it'd be great to get some really interesting reviews on Amazon and elsewhere for your book. Thank you, Robert, for sharing your wisdom and for sharing your time with us today. I know you're a busy guy, so thanks for coming on the show, and every blessing.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much.